This video is a kind of a remake of a presentation I have recently given just last week at the Science and Non-Duality Conference in San Jose in California. I went to this conference because this philosophy of non-dualism, which comes from the East and it's thousands of years old, originally called Advaita Vedanta, which is the original name, we translate that into non-dualism. It is a kind of the Eastern version of the philosophy of idealism in the West. It's more ancient than these ideas in the West, of course, but it resonates very much. Both philosophies entail that reality unfolds within consciousness itself, that there isn't an external world outside mind out there. And of course, since I am a proponent of the philosophy of idealism, it is unsurprising that I found myself going to the Science and Non-Duality Conference, which is an excellent gathering, and I gave a presentation there. And I've been asked by several people to make that presentation available to them rather on short term. It resonated well with people there, so that's the motivation for this video. I slightly adapted the original presentation so it would make sense to a broader audience. Yet I continue to use the term non-dualism, which I just introduced, so you know what it is now, and I feel free to use the G word, the word God, which I normally don't use, but in that audience it made sense. It helped the understanding of the ideas I wanted to convey. So I continue to use the word now. But I hope that you keep in mind that I'm using the word God in context. The context makes clear what I mean by the word God. And that's what I mean and nothing else, okay? I've slightly changed the title now. I'm calling it now Non-Dualism and the Fallacies of Panpsychism and Artificial Sentience. Because I wanted to achieve three things with this presentation. I wanted to introduce my what I believe to be a modern articulation of this consciousness-only ontology. I believe it can be defended based only on reason and empirical evidence. I believe that we do not really need spiritual insight to conclude that a consciousness-only ontology is the best we can come up with to make sense of reality, the most parsimonious, the most logical, and the most empirically honest and consistent ontology that we can come up with. Of course, spiritual insight is very important. It's transformative. I don't deny its importance, on the contrary. But for coming up with a cultural narrative, an ontology that makes more sense, I don't think it's needed. So I will articulate non-dualism here in this presentation purely from reason and empirical evidence, not from spiritual insight. And I wanted to contrast it with two modern ideas that are becoming very popular in science and in the culture at large today. One of them is panpsychism, this idea that all matter has consciousness as opposed to being in consciousness. And the notions of artificial sentience that we see now in many movies like Ex Machina, this idea that engineers can create a being that has a private, subjective inner life of its own. I wanted to contrast non-dualism to these two things, which I think are based on delusions, and that's what I'm going to argue now. So let's go forward here. And the first thing that I wanted to make clear is that even within the non-dualism community, different views are promoted and talked about as if they were all consistent with a consciousness-only ontology, as if they were all consistent with non-dualism. For instance, even in the Science and Non-Duality Conference, if you go to different presentations and you talk to different people over lunch or in the corridors, you hear the view that consciousness is a fundamental building block of reality, like space-time and the properties of matter. It's a very popular view, even in the non-dual community. And another one, in the words of Sri Nisargadatta Maharaj, one of the Indian sages that promoted the modern view of non-dualism, he said, "The world we perceive is made of consciousness. What we call matter is consciousness itself." And you see these two views circulating in the community as if they were both expressions of non-dualism and compatible with one another. But if you look carefully into this, are they really the same? Are they even really compatible? On the one hand, the first one, you have consciousness as a building block of reality, like space-time and the properties of matter. And in the other view, you have only consciousness, matter itself being an expression of consciousness. If we compare these two views and put them side by side, you see that the first view entails that there is a sort of bottom-up build up of the world from basic building blocks, like little Lego bricks, like space-time, consciousness, and matter, wherein consciousness and matter are seen as connected, like every little bit of matter corresponds to a little bit of consciousness, or has a little bit of consciousness as a fundamental property of itself, like matter, spin, momentum, and so forth. And then you put these little bits of matter slash consciousness together within the framework of space-time, and you end up with the world that we perceive. That's view number one, the panpsychist view, the notion that all matter has consciousness. View number two, which is true non-duality, true non-dualism, is the idea that there is only a field of consciousness. And I use the word field metaphorically here. There's only consciousness. And that the world emerges within this field of consciousness as a particular set and type of experiences, which we call perceptual experiences. It entails that consciousness is the only fundamental aspect of reality, everything else being reducible to consciousness. The reason we sort of confuse these views, even within the non-duality community, is easy to see. Both panpsychism, as it's often promoted in science today, and non-dualism entail that consciousness is fundamental, that it is irreducible, that you cannot explain consciousness in terms of something else. But if you look more carefully into what these views entail, you see that they differ. For instance, panpsychism would also say that space-time and the properties of matter are also fundamental, that they can't be reduced to consciousness. They exist side by side with consciousness. While non-dualism would say that space-time and the structure of matter are merely qualities of experience. They exist only insofar as they are experienced, and therefore they can be reduced to consciousness. So in a nutshell, panpsychism says that consciousness is in all matter, as a fundamental property of matter, while non-dualism would say, in a sense, the opposite, that all matter is in consciousness, as a particular type, a particular modality of experience in consciousness. So these views differ quite a bit. They are not even compatible with one another. Now the question, of course, is, it's fine that they're different. It's fine that only one can be called non-dualism and the other not. But labels aside, which one is the better view? Which one explains better the reality we experience every day? To answer this question, let's start from what we actually know. What we know about the world, independent of metaphysics, independent of worldview or theories. We know that there is experience. That's the fundamental, primary datum of reality. There is experience. Without it, we wouldn't be talking about anything here. Therefore, there is that which experiences. We might call it consciousness, but any word we use for it sort of implicitly passes on certain attributes that I may not want to associate with that which experiences. So I will keep on using this expression, this very neutral expression. There is that which experiences. I don't know what it is. I don't know where its boundaries lie. I don't know what its fundamental nature is, but I know that it is there because there is experience. We know that this thing that we perceive called brain and the associated brain function, we know that that thing correlates with another type of experience that we may call inner life. It correlates with other experiences. We know that. Neuroscience informs us of that. And finally, we also know that whatever matter is, whatever the fundamental nature of matter is, we know that the brain is a material system just like the rest of the cosmos. It's made up of the same kinds of atoms and force fields and so on. There isn't a fundamental difference at a very fundamental level between the brain and the rest of the universe. So these are the things we know, irrespective of metaphysics or theory. Now the question is, what is the simplest explanation for what we know? What is the most parsimonious, intuitive explanation for these things that we have just seen we know? The first thing to take into account, or to put forward, so to say, is that It is simplest to say that experience is a behavior of that which experiences, like the dance of a dancer, or like the ripples of water. Why is this the simplest view? Because it doesn't require us to postulate or infer anything beyond that which experiences. We don't need any other ontological primitive, any other fundamental aspect of reality. In the same way, for the same reasons that there is nothing more to ripples than water, there is nothing more to a dance but the dancer, there is nothing more to experience but that which experiences, behaving, moving in a certain way, like the dancer moves to create a dance, like the water moves to create ripples. And then the complexity we see around us, the variety and the dynamics of reality we see around us can be explained simply as the behavior, the dynamic and varied behavior of that which experiences. Like ripples can be very varied, like choreographies can be very varied. The next point is to grant that there are two perspectives to experience, the first and the second person perspective. And the brain, as such, is simply the second person perspective of first person experience, or inner life, which is another word for first person experience. This way, if I'm looking at sitting on a meadow and looking at the flowers, the grasses, the blue sky and the clouds, that direct experience of the meadows is my inner life, is my first person experience. But if there were a neuroscientist here sitting next to me and observing my brain, measuring my brain, observing its activity, my brain and its activity would be the second person perspective of my first person experience of the meadow. The second person perspective would be the experience of the meadows from the point of view of the neuroscientist. In other words, the flowers, the grasses, the blue sky and the clouds would appear to the neuroscientist in the form of my brain and its activity. Notice that I'm not saying that the brain generates experience. I'm not passing any ontological judgment. I'm just saying that there are two points of view, two perspectives to experience, two camera angles of the same phenomenon. Now, given these three most parsimonious interpretations of what we know, we necessarily have to grant something else. We have to grant the existence of what in the conference I called a cosmic brain. Normally I call it mind at large, which is a more neutral term, but with that audience, a cosmic brain resonated more, I thought. And the reason is simple. You see, if the brain is a material system like the rest of the cosmos, as we've seen, and if the brain is the second person perspective, a second person perspective of first person direct experience or inner life, and there is nothing more to a brain but the same particles and force fields that form the cosmos as a whole, then I have no alternative but to grant that the cosmos too must also be the second person perspective of first person experience. In other words, the cosmos is the second person perspective of cosmic inner life. Another way to put it is to say that the cosmos is thus God's brain. The universe is to the inner life of God, like my brain is to my inner subjective life, my inner subjective experience. That's basically the idea. And you may say, well, this doesn't add up, Bernardo, because the universe looks nothing like a brain. Right? And if you're right, it should look like a brain. Well, it doesn't look like a brain because we occupy a very small segment of the universe. We are sitting next to some neurotransmitter molecules, which are like little pieces of matter spread apart with nothing in between. It doesn't look like an interconnected brain. But at the largest scales, we know that the universe does look like a brain. This is scientifically attested. Here on the left side, you see a photograph of a few neurons and their interconnects in a mouse's brain. And on the right-hand side, it's a simulated image of our universe at the largest scales. And they pretty much look like one another. And you might say, well, this an image comparison is misleading because you can always crop the image in a certain way and highlight certain sections and play with colors so they look alike. But in fact, there has been a mathematical study of this, the topography, the network topography or topology of the universe, and comparisons with the brain, and they have been shown at the mathematical level to really be similar to one another. There was a press release by the University of California at San Diego, which did most of the study a few years ago, in which they basically said the structure of the universe and the laws that govern its growth may be more similar than previously thought to the structure and growth of the human brain. So the similarity is indeed there. Now, how do these two perspectives emerge? Why would two perspectives of experience emerge in one universal cosmic mind? Because that's basically what I'm suggesting, that there are two perspectives. Why is that the case? Given that in one integrated mind, one integrated psyche, you don't have two perspectives, right? For instance, in one mind where you have ideas and emotions, there is only one perspective. And these ideas and emotions are associated with one another. In other words, you have certain ideas that evoke certain emotions, which in turn evoke other ideas, which evoke other emotions, and so on and so forth. They are associated through links, evocative links of experience. My suggestion is that when there is dissociation arising in one integrated mind, what you have is that a subset of ideas and emotions start to evoke each other in a sort of a cluster of mental contents, but stop evoking other ideas and other emotions in the rest of that mind. In other words, this cluster of ideas and emotions becomes dissociated from the rest. They no longer evoke the rest. They only evoke internally one another. And the formation of this so-called dissociated alter, and that's language from psychology, because we understand dissociation. People manifest dissociation every day. An extreme form would be multiple identity disorder or multiple personality disorder, which today is actually called dissociated identity disorder, where people have multiple personalities that sometimes don't even know of each other or don't like each other. Because a dissociated alter, a localization of internally associated ideas and emotions, acquires an illusory sense of separate identity. It becomes alienated from the rest of the mental content in that mind. When that happens, a psychic boundary forms around that alter. And my suggestion is that although there is a boundary, the alter is still immersed. It's still immersed in the broader psyche, as you see here. And the cognitive activity in the broader psyche, or the ideas and emotions in the broader psyche immediately surrounding that alter as movements of mind, as movements of consciousness, they stimulate that boundary. They bounce off that boundary, so to say, here on the sides. And they influence, of course, the subjective perspective of the alter. This stimulation of the boundary, this movement of external psychic activity exciting the boundary, is what we call sense perceptions. If we are alters of this one cosmic mind, what are the boundaries of our alter? It's our skin, the boundaries of our body, our skin, our eyes, our ears, our tongue, our sense organs. And when the cognitive activity within this one mind, but outside our alter, the cosmic activity in the neighborhood, in the surroundings of our alter, is active, it's dynamic, it's moving, so to say. It stimulates the boundaries of our alter, in other words, our sense organs, leading to sense perception. So sense perception isn't a stimulus coming from a world outside mind, outside consciousness. We don't need to infer or postulate that magical world. It's simply the result of cognitive activity in consciousness, but outside and in the neighborhood of our alter. It's outside our alter, but not outside consciousness or mind itself. I'm using the words consciousness and mind interchangeably here. So from the point of view of the alter, the ideas and emotions in the mind of God, so to say, can only be perceived through stimulation of the boundaries of our alter, and we perceive them in the form of the outside world. When I sit on the meadow and I look at the flowers, the grasses, the sky, the blue sky, and the clouds, I am basically seeing the result of God's emotions and ideas, the first perspective of the experience of cosmic mind, from a second person perspective. The ideas and emotions in the mind of God appear to me in the form of the flowers, the fields, the clouds, and the sky. That's the basic premise. And it is a very non-dual idea. As Nisargadatta Maharaj wrote decades ago, when you see the world, you see God. There is no seeing God apart from the world. Beyond the world, to see God is to be God. In other words, beyond the second person perspective of God's inner life, which we call the world, to see God is to be God, to acquire God's first person perspective instead of the second person perspective we can normally access. I think Nisargadatta meant this quite literally. I don't think this is a subtle metaphor for some kind of abstract spiritual idea. Not at all. I think he just said it the way it is. I don't know how much more clear the man could have been. He just said it the way it is. All right. So according to this view, the body, or any biological body, is the perceptual image of dissociation. Basically what I'm saying is that the cosmic mind, or God, has dissociative identity disorder. And I put the disorder between quotes because I don't mean it in a negative way, it's just what it is. Dissociative identity disorder is the modern name for multiple personality disorder, which you are probably all familiar with. And we are the dissociated alters of God's mind. We are the multiple split-off personalities of God, which acquire an illusory sense of separation and personal or individual identity. Our bodies are what these dissociated alters look like from the point of view of other alters. Remember, we said that within the cosmic mind, alters form, and that the activity around the alter stimulates the boundary, creating sense perception. But notice that in this cognitive activity around one alter, there could be another alter, which is part of that stimulating cognitive activity. So the other alter should stimulate this perceptual boundary here and appear according to some image, some identifying unique image. What I'm saying is that a biological body is that image. It's what one dissociated alter of mind at large looks like when it stimulates the boundary of another alter, or even the same alter if I look down at my body. The body is what the alter looks like on the screen of perception. People who do have dissociative identity disorder, or DID, if you put them in a functional brain scanner, like an fMRI, you can actually see here the image of their dissociated cognitive processes. It's right there. Those dissociated processes look like something. They can be identified. This is a paper published last year on PLOS, by the way. So if the universe as a whole is God's brain, how can we diagnose DID in God's brain? Well, for starters, we don't need a brain scanner because we are already inside God's brain. We are inside the universe. We are already inside. We don't need a scanner to see through a skull. We are already in. So let's just look around. What are the dissociated processes in God's brain? It's other people, other living beings, insects, plants, amoeba, whatever. Whatever is alive is the image of a dissociated process in God's brain. So to do the diagnosis, we just need to look around. And of course, the idea of so above as below can be seen here. As above, so below. Now, you might ask, is this scientifically substantiated, Bernardo? Of course it is. Already 10 years ago, in 2005, Professor Richard Cohn Henry from Johns Hopkins published a paper on Nature magazine, the world's most respected scientific journal, where he claimed quite straightforwardly here that the universe is entirely mental. He even used the word spiritual. He said the universe is mental and spiritual, so live and enjoy. He said that based on experiments coming out from physics, basically experiments about quantum entanglement, which started back in 1981 by people like Alain Aspect in France. There were several experiments done along the 80s, even in the late 90s. There were a couple of experiments done in Switzerland which proved that. And those experiments suggested very strongly that reality is not outside mind. It's not outside mentation. It's not outside consciousness. And that's what Professor Conhenry was referring to when he said that physics basically proved that the universe is mental. Now you might ask, what happened since then, Bernardo? What have we learned since then? Well, we've learned through many more experiments and publications done in peer-reviewed scientific journals that the conclusions were reinforced. In other words, that Professor Conhenry's conclusions were actually valid. More sophisticated experiments were done. This year, 2 very sophisticated experiments were done, one in Australia, one here in the Netherlands, where I live, at the Delft University of Technology. And this latter one, Nature even considered to be, quote, the toughest test yet of quantum entanglement. And it's very hard to make sense of the results of these experiments without giving up the idea that the world is outside consciousness. And I'm being generous here. It may be completely untenable to make sense of those experiments unless we grant that all reality unfolds in consciousness itself. So the idea of a cosmic mind of which we are dissociated authors has scientific substantiation. And it's amazing that it's not more discussed in the mainstream media. Now, let's go back to panpsychism. We've been discussing here a view in which all is basically in one mind, one consciousness, separate minds, dissociated minds being just an illusion, a dissociative process in this one mind. But that's not what panpsychists say. Panpsychists say that all matter has mind, all matter has consciousness, instead of all being in one mind. Their error is the following, in my mind, in my opinion. They assume that the structure of the behavior of consciousness is the structure of consciousness itself. This is akin to saying that when you drop a pebble in water and the ripples form in the form of concentric rings, it's equivalent to saying that the water is made of concentric rings. It isn't. Concentric rings are the structure of the behavior of water, namely ripples. They are the structure of what water does, the movements of water. The water itself is not made of concentric rings. The water is water, right? So when panpsychists look at the world and see matter, fragmented matter, little bits of matter that can go down to the subatomic level, they make this exact same mistake. They take that fragmentation to be the structure of consciousness itself. But it isn't. It's the structure of the behavior of consciousness. Since matter is experienced and exists only insofar as it's experienced, and it is the behavior of consciousness, as we concluded earlier. So it's a very simple error. It's a fault in thinking, I think, that panpsychists make. And artificial sentience, this notion that engineers can create a conscious being, a being with a private, dissociated, subjective inner life of its own, that whole idea is based on panpsychism. It's based on this notion that because matter is fragmented and each bit of matter is associated or correlated with a little bit of consciousness, if you put these little bits of matter slash consciousness together in some complex way through computer systems, silicon, software, whatever, that you will create then a more complex mind out of little bits of very simple mentation, very simple consciousness. It's entirely based on this notion that consciousness itself is fragmented, which is the fallacy of panpsychism. The idea is that you can build complex life, complex consciousness, through the bottom-up combination of simpler bits of consciousness, of simpler parts. Something like this. You start from these little bits of matter, each little bit of matter associated to a little bit of consciousness. You somehow put them together, and boom, they combine and create a complex mind, a complex consciousness with richer inner life. Obviously, there are two problems with this, and one we have already seen. It starts from a false assumption. It starts from the idea that consciousness is fundamentally fragmented, and there is no reason to believe that, as we've just seen. But it makes yet another error, perhaps an even more serious error, and it is this step here. This step here is an appeal to magic. It reminds me of that cartoon where there's a mathematician reviewing a derivation by another mathematician. It's a very complex chain of mathematical steps, and then in the middle there is a step called "then a miracle occurs." And the reviewer says, I think you should be more explicit here in step 2. This is the invocation of a miracle. After all, what kind of physical process could account for a combination of mentality? Electromagnetic communication? I'm immersed in electromagnetic fields right now, internet access points, cell towers, and I'm not merging with the internet or with the minds of other people who are immersed in the same electromagnetic fields. Touch? We can touch other people. Presumably, we can even touch our brains if our skull were open, and I don't think our minds would merge. As a matter of fact, neurons don't even touch. At the place where one neuron would touch another, if you zoom in this little square here, as it's shown here, if you zoom in and look carefully, there is a gap in between the synapses, the places where the neurons, quote, touch one another. That gap is called the synaptic cleft. The neurons don't actually touch. To bridge that gap, they basically throw stones at each other, neurotransmitter molecules, which you can see here, the little red balls. Neurons don't even touch. So how come we have an integrated inner life, presumably made up of little bits of consciousness from different neurons? And the whole thing doesn't add up for these two reasons. The assumption that consciousness is fundamentally fragmented, which doesn't hold any water, and this appeal to magic in the last step here. This appeal to a miracle, some kind of physical process that combines psyches together, which is totally unjustified and lack any empirical grounding. The non-dual view, however, does not need magic. It does not need miracles. It basically says that consciousness is already one. So it doesn't need to magically combine. It's already one. There is only one consciousness, and the illusion of personal, separate, individual psyches arises from a process of top-down dissociation. There are no separate psyches in reality. There is only an illusion of separation that arises from dissociation. This is a view that is empirically honest. It doesn't require any appeal to magic because dissociation is a well-known process. Any psychiatric ward is full of extreme cases of dissociation, and even we experience dissociation in our lives. Even we, sometimes we can't relate to our own thoughts as we had them a while ago, or we can't relate to our own memories, or we see parts of ourselves as alien parts of ourselves when we are neurotic, or let alone when we are psychotic. So it requires nothing that we don't already to some good degree understand and have empirical grounding for. It's a much better ontology, much more honest, much more reasonable. How do we then restore sanity to this quest for the artificial creation of a being with a private subjective inner life of its own, or the quest for artificial sentience? The first step is to just grant how nonsensical this idea of creating consciousness is. How can you create consciousness? Consciousness is what there is. It's the ground, the basis of reality. It's that wherein all creation happens. It can't be created because it's the starting point of all existence. When you talk about artificially creating a sentient being, what we actually mean is that we want to artificially induce dissociation in this cosmic mind, in this cosmic consciousness, or mind at large, or God, whatever you want to call it. It's the artificial inducement of dissociation that we are talking about to create a private inner life through artificial means. It's not the creation of consciousness because consciousness is already there. It's the creation of a dissociated alter of that consciousness that is the starting point of the whole thing. That's what we actually mean. And I don't doubt that that is possible. But if it is possible, the image that we'll have is life, because life, biology, is the image of dissociation. It's what dissociation in cosmic mind looks like insofar as we can know. So since computers and robots aren't alive, they don't manifest metabolism, reproduction, internal organization, spontaneous internal organization, negative internal entropy, since they don't have any of the characteristics of life and biology, they won't be conscious. They won't be conscious in the sense of having a dissociated, private, subjective inner life of their own. Of course, they will be in consciousness, like all reality, but they will not be conscious. These are different things. I do think that we might succeed in artificially inducing dissociation in mind at large, and therefore creating a being with a private subjective inner life of its own. But if we succeed in that, it will look much more like this, like a bacteria to begin with, than like the intelligent conscious robot of Ex Machina. Unfortunately, because the robot is certainly a lot more attractive than a little bacteria. But let's be honest here. I think when we talk about creating artificial consciousness, in fact, we are talking about trying to induce dissociation through artificial means. And the name for that is abiogenesis in science, the creation of life from non-life. You see, life is the phenomenon of private or dissociated subjective inner life arising in the universe. That's what life is. It's that dissociation. And life is quite unique. I mean, it's completely empirically unjustified to say that life is a mechanical process like any other. It obviously isn't. Metabolism, self-organization, reproduction, all the characteristics of life, even things that are very difficult to explain, like illustrated here. This is a process of protein folding, which happens all the time within our bodies very quickly, which is a great mystery because computers take forever to do it. Yeah, these are all unique characteristics of life, which make life unique. And you see, if there is dissociation in this cosmic mind, that's also a unique process that should have a unique particular image. And since we have private dissociated inner lives, and I'm not merged with the universe right now, apparently, I know I have a private inner life of my own, dissociated, and since I know I am alive, because I manifest all the characteristics of life, metabolism, self-organization, reproduction, and so on, then the conclusion is inevitable. Life is the image of dissociation of this cosmic mind. Biology is that image. When engineers talk of creating artificial consciousness in a computer in silicon, they make a very simple mistake. You see, they think that it's enough to simulate in silicon the patterns of information flow that can be measured in a real brain, like a human brain or an animal brain. But you see, a simulation isn't the phenomenon that it is trying to simulate. Isn't that obvious? I mean, I can simulate the working of kidneys on my computer and all their steps and have here at the end urination, for instance, in my simulation. But that doesn't mean that my computer will pee on my desk. A simulation of kidneys doesn't create actual urine. It doesn't make the computer pee. I blush to have to explain this to people who dream of creating artificial consciousness just by simulating information flow as measured in real living brains. The simulation isn't the phenomenon. The whole idea, quite frankly, in my mind, is pathetic. It's a distorted expression of a repressed religious impulse. That's what you see in transhumanism, this idea of creating super intelligent living machines. It's a distorted religious impulse manifesting itself through the back door, given the constraints of the crazy ontology of materialism. So that's the key message. So let's summarize this from the beginning. There is experience. That's the primary datum of existence. Therefore, there is that which experiences, since experience requires an experiencer. I will call that which experiences TWE, to make it short and avoid attributing any quality to it that I don't mean to attribute. So I'm not calling it consciousness or mind or subjectivity or anything. I'm calling it TWE. What are experiences? Experiences are both the behavior, the movement of TWE, like the dance of a dancer, like ripples of water, and the witnessing of such behavior by TWE itself. The movement and the witnessing of that movement are one and the same process, namely experience. And since the behavior of TWE can account for all experience, and since reality only exists insofar as it is experienced, then TWE alone is sufficient to explain all reality. We do not need to postulate a world outside the TWE, outside consciousness. TWE alone suffices to make sense of it all life, all reality, the entire universe, and multiverses for all I know. What is the inner life of each living being? It's a dissociated alter of TWE. which arises from top-down dissociation as opposed to bottom-up combination of simpler psyches. Living organisms, our appearance, is simply what an outer looks like from a second-person perspective. You're now seeing my body. That's the second-person perspective, as experienced by you, of my inner life, of what I am experiencing right now, my ideas, my perceptions, my emotions. Those look to you in the form of this physical body. The body is the image of the dissociated outer on the screen of perception. Panpsychists mistakenly attribute the structure of the behavior of TWE to TWE itself. It's like saying that the anatomy of the dancer corresponds to the choreography of the dance. It's absurd. The choreography is the structure of the behavior, the movement of the dancer, not the structure of the dancer itself, not the anatomy of the dancer. Concentric rings are the structure of ripples, the behavior of water. The water is not made of concentric rings. For the same reason, consciousness is not made of little bits of matter. Consciousness is what it is. It's the one fundamental aspect of reality, matter being a behavior of consciousness, which of course is witnessed, is experienced in consciousness. And to create an artificial being capable of a private, subjective inner life of its own, what you need to do is to artificially induce dissociation in TWE, not simulate the information flows that we can measure in a brain, simulate that in silicon, because a simulation is not the phenomenon. A computer running a simulation of kidneys will not be on your desk. That's basically it. If you want to get into more depth about these ideas and their implications for culture, science, media, and society at large, this is my latest book. It's available everywhere, certainly available on Amazon and other online stores. It's called Brief Peeks Beyond. I hope you enjoyed it. Take care.